Some people say that the church in the early days didn't accept certain books of the Bible, which would have embarrassed Christianity. Is this so, and why did they do that? First and foremost, asking this question means we need to make an admission. Contrary to what many people think, that the Bible is one book written by the hand of God Himself, or dictated word for word to human beings, the Bible is a collection of books written by different human authors over many years. The 39 books of the Old Testament were agreed to by Jewish leaders, which Christianity just inherited. Now, the 27 books of the New Testament were also agreed to by Christian leaders in the early days of the faith. So how did the Christian leaders decide which books to accept and which to reject? You see, Christians began following Jesus long before the stories about Jesus were written down in books. The apostles founded churches and taught the Jesus followers the story of Jesus' life and His commands. And in those cultures, the practice of committing stories to memory and passing those stories down orally to the next generation was very common. It was for these stories that they had lived their lives, been persecuted, and some even killed. According to many scholars, the first book of the Bible to be written was Paul's letter to the Galatians, at most 20 years after Jesus' death. And though just a letter and not a full account, it already contained bits and pieces of the story of Jesus. So scholars believe that the first full account of Jesus' life was Mark's account, called the Gospel of Mark, written between 20 to 40 years after Jesus' death. It is believed to be based on Mark's interview with Jesus' disciples who were alive then. The other accounts then followed at different times, but all before the end of the first century. Therefore, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written during the first century. They were quite close to each other in their description of the life of Jesus Christ and to the stories of Jesus that church leaders and members had already been taught orally, and so were easily accepted. But years after these accounts, other accounts began to show up, telling different stories about Jesus that many church members and leaders couldn't recognize as in line with the oral stories that they had received. And this led to no small amounts of confusion, and some Christians began to be led astray by these accounts. Leaders of the church, like Athanasius, tried to stem this by coming up with an acceptable list of New Testament books to be read in churches under his guidance. And later, leaders from different geographic areas of Christianity came together in the councils in the 4th century to finally decide which books to officially recognize. Books written after the 1st century, which couldn't be traced to an apostle or student of an apostle, were thus rejected, leading to the official 27 books of the New Testament. And so we end with 2 questions for the skeptics and 1 for believers. How does the Jesus painted by the excluded books line up with the recorded history outside of the Bible about the self-sacrificial lives led by the early Christians and their founding apostles? Why does the excluded books that the early church used to cherish but written late, like the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache, hardly feature in sensational reporting about hidden books, whilst only the so-called scandalous ones are mentioned? And how will you, a follower of Jesus Christ, know about deception from both within your church and outside of it if you aren't willing to find out how you got the Bible you read today? Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for other interesting videos.